Hi, and welcome to the Life After Whipple project. I'm Greg Adams, a pancreatic cancer survivor and the current team leader. And with me is my commander-in-chief, Patty Hine. Most of us don't really know much about the pancreas until we discover a dangerous alien living and growing on it. Tonight's presentation begins a series of programs focusing on what the pancreas does, or rather used to do, before some or all of it gets removed. Tonight, we will focus on the endocrine functions, the regulation of blood sugar through insulin and glucagon. Our presenter is Dr. Kathleen Estrada, an endocrinologist at Henry Ford Health in Detroit, Michigan. Dr. Estrada, I'll let you take it from here.
Hi, thank you, Greg, so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me here tonight. Can you please let me know if you can see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. So today we're going to be focusing on glucose regulation. So here are the topics I'm going to go over. I'm going to review the endocrine function of the pancreas, diabetes after Whipple, or what is also referred to as type 3C diabetes, insulin, and diabetes technology. So I just wanted to give a sense of where in the body we're talking about when we say the pancreas, but I know Dr. Kwan also gave a very good overview of the anatomy last time, so I won't get into that, but just wanted to give you a sense of where the pancreas is within the body. So the pancreas has two functions. It has an exocrine function and an endocrine function. If we were to take a cross-section of the pancreas, focusing on this image up here, this is what we would see. You would see glands around the outside that we refer to as acini, and this is where the exocrine enzymes are released from. On the inside portion here, you'll see this labeled as the islet of Langerhans. This is the endocrine portion of the pancreas. And then that islet has been blown up here in this diagram. So I'll talk a little bit more about the endocrine function, but I did want to just briefly touch on the exocrine. So the exocrine portion of the pancreas helps with digestion. So it releases these enzymes that I have listed here that help break down our food and get into our cells. So trypsin is an enzyme that helps break down protein that we eat. Amylase helps break down carbohydrates, so starches like our bready foods and our pastas. And lipase helps to break down fats. So these enzymes travel down the pancreatic duct and meet up with bile from the common bile duct. And then these enter the duodenum, or the kind of beginning part of our intestine, through this opening here called the ampulla of Vater. From there, these enzymes digest our food and allow those nutrients to get into our system. So now focusing on the endocrine portion, so as I mentioned earlier, this is referred to as the islet of Langerhans. If you look at these pink cells surrounding, you'll see that they're called alpha cells, and these alpha cells secrete a hormone called glucagon. Within the center, you see these yellow cells. Those are the beta cells. These are the cells that secrete insulin. And then kind of speckled throughout, you see these green cells that we call delta cells. And they secrete a hormone called somatostatin. So what do these hormones do? So our beta cells, which compose 50 to 70% of our islet, produces a hormone called insulin. Insulin allows the uptake of glucose or sugar into our cells, so removing it from our bloodstream and reducing our blood sugar. And it also tells the liver to reduce the release of sugar, also lowering our blood sugar. Our alpha cells, which compose 20 to 30% of the islet, produces a hormone called glucagon, and glucagon stimulates the liver to release sugar. The delta cells compose the smallest portion, which is about 10% of the islet, and releases a hormone called somatostatin. And somatostatin inhibits the secretion of insulin and glucagon. And what hormone is secreted really is regulated by the blood sugar level, but altogether they help to maintain an appropriate blood sugar level so that your body can function normally. So moving on to diabetes, in particular type 3C diabetes. So where did type 3C, the name, come from? So this comes from the way that the American Diabetes Association kind of categorized the different kinds of diabetes. So in type 1, and it was an outline specifically that they developed. So in type 1 diabetes, which is when all of the beta cells are destroyed and someone requires insulin, was labeled as 1. Type 2 diabetes, which typically results due to issues with insulin resistance, was labeled type 2, and all other kinds of diabetes was under the label of type 3. And beyond that, they subcategorized it further. So under the classification of class C are diseases of exocrine pancreas, and this includes conditions such as pancreatitis, which is an inflammation of the pancreas, trauma to the pancreas or surgery done to the pancreas, such as Whipple, or cancers to the pancreas. So the name stuck, and so you can see how they came up with type 3C. So looking at these charts on the left, so you get kind of a sense of how common the different kinds of diabetes are. We see labeled in kind of the orange color here, the majority of diabetes tends to be type 2 diabetes. The next most common is type 1 diabetes, and then lastly is type 3C diabetes. They further looked into that, into what's the frequency of different kinds of type 3C diabetes. So the most common cause of type 3C is chronic pancreatitis, meaning chronic inflammation of the pancreas, in which people can lose function of their beta cells. And here we see a 2% here, and that's correlating to the percent of incidences when post-surgery of the pancreas results in type 3C diabetes, just to get a sense of how frequent these things are. So how do you diagnose type 3C diabetes? There's really not an accepted kind of universal criteria, but just conceptually, you can diagnose this in somebody if they meet these 3 criteria. So those people that actually meet the criteria for diabetes, which I'll jump to my next slide for a moment. So here are the criteria to be diagnosed with diabetes. You have to be having symptoms of diabetes plus a random blood sugar of greater than or equal to 200, or a fasting blood sugar, meaning no food intake for the last 8 hours, of a blood sugar of greater than or equal to 126. The next criteria you can meet is through a test we call the oral glucose tolerance test, where essentially we give you a very sugary drink and measure your blood sugar 2 hours later. If 2 hours later your blood sugar is 200 or above, you get the diagnosis of diabetes. And then lastly, we can also measure kind of a hemoglobin A1C, which gives you the average or gets you a sense of what your blood sugars are averaging. We say if you have an A1C of 6.5% or over, that you get the classification of diabetes. So I'm going to jump back to my previous slide. So that's one thing that you need for diagnosis. You can also consider this particular diagnosis if someone has a known disease of the exocrine pancreas. So some of the things we talked about, the chronic pancreatitis and the surgery. And then thirdly, if you can more or less be certain that the cause of the diabetes is from the exocrine pancreas issues. So generally, if you can fulfill these, you can meet the diagnosis of type 3C diabetes. So there was a systematic review done that I listed the citation below that actually looked at different studies that looked into type 3C diabetes and different aspects associated with that. And these were some of their conclusions, one of which they noticed, well, these tended to be risk factors for people that ended up developing type 3C diabetes after a partial pancreatectomy. And so in the people that had a higher preoperative A1C, meaning greater than 5.7%, were at a higher risk of developing type 3C diabetes. Those that had a higher fasting blood glucose also were at higher risk. And those that had a lower volume of remaining pancreatic tissue were also at higher risk for developing type 3C diabetes. They also were able to look at the incidences of type 3C diabetes in relation to what portion of the pancreas was resected. So in those that had Whipple surgery, they found there was a 16% rate of developing type 3C. Those that had a distal pancreatectomy had a 21% rate. And those that had a central pancreatectomy, so the middle portion, had a rate of 6% of developing type 3C. So typically it's thought that the distal portion of the pancreas tends to have more of these islets of Langerhans. So if you lose that portion, they think that's why it led to kind of a higher frequency compared to the other two locations. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between type 2 and type 3C diabetes. I feel that for those people that have type 2 diabetes preceding surgery that were maybe very well controlled on maybe oral medications, life with diabetes after a Whipple or pancreatic surgery can be very different. So in type 2 diabetes, it's often associated with insulin resistance. So this means that our cells, which are supposed to listen to the insulin and take up sugar, are not listening to the insulin. So that leads to more high blood sugar. So a lot of times what you'll see is that people with type 2 diabetes actually have a higher insulin level to try and overcome this resistance. And sometimes they actually do end up needing insulin to overcome this. But a lot of the times people with type 2 diabetes can manage their diabetes with oral medications. In type 3C diabetes, because of the nature of the surgery and the loss of the islets of Langerhans, which is where insulin is produced, you'll often see insulin is required. The other difference is that the alpha cells are there too on the islet, so you're also losing the glucagon production, which helps to prevent low blood sugar. And so you may notice more of kind of an up and down in regulation of the blood sugar. So low blood sugars can be a bigger problem, and sometimes people can get labeled as having brittle diabetes because of these fluctuations. Another aspect to keep in mind is that in type 3C diabetes, because you're also affecting those acinine, you may also lose exocrine function and actually may need to be given pancreatic enzymes to make up for that as well. So I wanted to go into the history a little bit about insulin, because I do find it very interesting. So in 1889, there were two German researchers that found that when they removed the pancreas glands from dogs, the dogs developed diabetes. In 1910, Sir Edward Albert suggested that there was one chemical missing from the pancreas of people with diabetes, and he decided to call this chemical insulin. And this comes from the Latin word insula, which means island, similar to islet. In 1921, there was a young surgeon named Frederick Banting and his assistant named Charles Fest, who figured out how to actually isolate insulin from a dog's pancreas. And in 1922, a young boy named Leonard Thompson, who was dying from diabetes, became the first person to receive an injection of insulin. And within 24 hours, his very high blood sugar levels dropped down to near normal. And in 1923, they received the Nobel Prize for discovering insulin. And they actually ended up selling the patent to Eli Lilly for only $1 because they wanted everyone that needed insulin to have access. So insulin, how does it work? So kind of what I alluded to earlier, if you imagine these are our cells have what's called an insulin receptor. And when the insulin comes down and binds to this receptor, it tells the cell to go ahead and start taking in glucose or blood sugar. So that's essentially how insulin works. So I wanted to explain a little bit about the concept of how we replace insulin. So for basal insulin, which is often referred to as long-acting insulin, we have to think about, well, what does our body naturally do? Our liver releases sugar, and at any time it can be releasing sugar. So our body has to produce insulin to keep this sugar under control. That means even when we're not eating, there always has to be a little bit of insulin. So that's why we call it basal insulin. So we actually do have basal insulins that can last from anywhere between 12 hours to just over 24 hours. It's really meant to keep the sugar in control even when we're not eating. The second kind of group of insulin that we have is often referred to as short-acting insulin, or some people might call it their mealtime insulin. This is because naturally when we eat, our pancreas releases insulin to help control the blood sugars from the meals we eat. So another term you might hear used is prandial. Prandial just means meal. So these different insulins can have a varying onset time. So some of them start working within a few minutes, and some of them take 30 minutes to start working. And they can last anywhere between 4 to 6 hours. It just really depends on the formulation. You can also use this insulin to bring down a high blood sugar, even if you're not eating. So we also refer to it as correction insulin as well. So here I have a chart, just some of the different insulins we have in these categories. So at the top, we have what's referred to as rapid acting insulin. So some of the names you might hear is Humalog, Lispro, Aspart. These can take about 10 to 15 minutes to start working. So ideally, you want to give them about 10 to 15 minutes before you start eating. And they can last in the body between 3 to 5 hours or so. The next insulin, we call it short acting, and the other name we call it is regular. And typically it takes a little longer. It can take 30 minutes for this insulin to start working. So you really have to plan ahead and give this insulin 30 minutes before you eat. And it can last in the body about 6 to 6.5 hours. Now, below that is our basal insulins. So a lot of times people refer to them as long-acting, but really there is an intermediate option. The intermediate basal option we call is NPH. So it can take about 1 to 3 hours for this to kick in, but typically it lasts closer to 12 hours. So this one you have to give twice a day. The long-acting insulins, such as the ones listed here, so you might have heard of them, Lantus, Glargine, Basaglar, they can take 1 to 2 hours to start working, but they typically last about 22 to 24 hours. So that means just 1 shot a day, which can make life a lot easier. This is a kind of different representation of these insulins, just to give you a sense of their duration and kind of how their steady state is reached. So towards the left, we see our short-acting insulin. So we kind of see they have a more rapid time of onset, but a shorter time of duration. And our basal insulins, you see they last longer and they kind of vary in terms of how steady they are versus if they have a peak. So NPH does have a peak time versus Glargine that pretty much stays stable the whole time. So ideally, when you're doing basal insulin plus mealtime insulin, that can amount to anywhere from 4 to 5 shots a day. And understandably, sometimes that can be very challenging. So there is actually pre-mixed insulins available, and here are some of them. So there are mixed insulins available that can have Lispro or Humalog, Novolog, mixed with NPH. So our Humalog and Novologs, as we remember, take about 10 minutes to kick into effect. The other mixed insulin available has regular insulin and NPH. So you have to keep in mind, it takes a while for that regular to kick in. All pre-mixed mealtime insulins are typically dosed just twice a day. So it's really meant to cover you for the whole day, including your lunchtime without having to give an injection. That being said, it can be a little bit, allow for less flexibility in the dose adjustments. For example, you really do have to eat kind of a consistent amount every time because you're getting a very set dose of mealtime and basal. And if you say need more of your mealtime or less of your basal, you really can't adjust one without adjusting the other. So it does have its limitations, but if doing 4 or 5 injections a day is too tough, at least getting 2 injections a day is helpful. So what does life look like day to day with insulin? So typically we do test blood sugars 4 times a day. You typically check a fasting sugar, and this one really tells you how your basal insulin is doing since you're not eating overnight. So that's an important one to check. You also want to make sure you're checking before meals for different reasons. You want to see, well, how did my last dose do? Do I have to eventually adjust my dosing for my meals? Or it's, it's always possible is, oh, is my blood sugar too low? So it's a very important one to check. And then we also typically recommend checking before bedtime, especially because we want to avoid low blood sugars going into bedtime. In terms of the long acting, as I mentioned, depending on the duration of the insulin formulation, you can give it once a day or twice a day. It just really depends. You should always carry glucose tablets or juice or something just in case your sugar does go low, just so you're prepared to treat. And then you actually want to carry your short-acting insulin with you outside the home. If you end up eating outside the home or go somewhere else to eat, you still need to give your insulin with your mealtime. So you should carry that with you as well. And one of the things that can be very helpful in trying to maintain good blood sugars is eating eating a consistent amount of carbs. So kind of, paying more attention to the diet and how much you're eating is going to be very helpful and something that's going to play a big role day to day. So why is it so important to have good blood sugar control? That's because we want to prevent complications of uncontrolled diabetes. So I'm going to go over some of the complications that we want to look out for. One of them is diabetic retinopathy, and this is when over a long period of time, high blood sugars can affect the eyes, particularly the blood vessels in the retina. And in severe cases, people can develop bleeding and it can impact their vision. So in addition to having good blood sugar control, it's very important that you have an annual diabetes eye exam where the eye doctor will actually dilate your eyes and actually look at your retinas. It's important because if there are issues happening, they can take steps to provide treatments to prevent further progression. Another complication of uncontrolled diabetes is what we call nephropathy, which is when the kidneys are affected. And typically you don't really feel this happening until it's almost too late. So it's very important that you have your urine checked once a year to measure the amount of protein. A high amount of protein tells us that the diabetes is affecting your kidneys. It's important to keep track because there are also medications that can help slow the progression of this process. And lastly, another complication of diabetes is neuropathy. This means your nerves are affected from the blood sugar being so high, it damages the nerves, particularly of the feet. So it's very important that you doctor, whether it be your primary doctor or your endocrinologist, that someone's doing a foot exam. With uncontrolled diabetes, someone may not realize they have neuropathy of the feet because they feel numb. And what we worry about is if you have numb feet, you can't feel if you're stepping on something or have injured your foot. So that can progress to a very serious infection. So I know these can sound very scary, but I want to point out that with good blood sugar control, these things don't have to happen. Back in the early 1980s, they did all these trials to determine, well, what is, can these be prevented with a certain level of blood sugar control? And they found they were preventable and lowered your risk of getting these complications with good blood sugar control. So that being said, what are typically our blood sugar targets? So it's usually recommended to have an A1C of 7% or lower to reduce the risk of these complications. Your blood sugar targets, first thing in the morning or your fasting sugar, we try to aim for between 80 and 130. And blood sugars after you've eaten, 2 to 4 hours afterwards, the goal is to be less than 180. And here I thought this was a helpful chart just to get a sense of what does A1C correlate with what blood sugar. And we in the US use milligrams per deciliter, so this middle column here, but in most of the European countries, they use millimole per liter. So I mentioned that A1C target is 7% or below. So that's about an average blood sugar of 154 or a range of 123 to 185, just to get a sense of what does that mean. So I did want to show you an insulin pen. So before insulin pens, the way to give insulin, you had to use a glass vial that contained insulin and a syringe, which are still available. But now we have these insulin pens, which just makes it a little easier to give insulin. So the pen contains essentially what would amount to a vial of insulin that we see here. You would use the dial at the end here to turn it to the number of units you want to administer. And every time you give a new injection, you'd have to change out the needle at the top that we refer to as a pen needle. As you can see, they come very tiny now. And then from there, you would inject as you normally would with for example, like a syringe. And then you would just take the needle off and place the cap on, and you're all done. So this is an actual image of what an insulin pen looks like. And as you can see, you can barely see the needle. So they've come a long way in making this as comfortable as possible and as versatile as possible too. So I did want to go over a little bit about side effect of insulin, which the goal of insulin or its function is to reduce blood sugar. So a possible side effect is low blood sugar. When we say low blood sugar, we mean when the blood sugar is less than 70. And when the blood sugar is low, people can have different symptoms. Some of these include feeling hungry, feeling tired. Shaking and sweating is a very common one, headaches, dizziness, and very severe low blood sugars. People can become confused, they can have slurred speech, they can lose consciousness, and in very severe cases, have comas or seizures. So it's very important to treat a low blood sugar. Low blood sugar can happen for different reasons. In the setting with our diabetes management, having too much insulin can lead to low blood sugar. Other situations that low blood sugar can happen is if you eat less than your insulin dose is dosed for, or if you exercise more, meaning you end up burning more of that glucose or sugar. There's some medications that can also increase the risk of lowering your sugar. Alcohol can also do it. And then certain situations where we call reactive hypoglycemia or reactive low sugar. And that's typically seen in the setting of type 2 diabetes, where the body isn't quite responding as it should right away to food coming in, and it responds a little later, resulting in a hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. So if someone has a low blood sugar, first of all, if they're having symptoms, they should always check their blood sugar to see if they are having low blood sugar and confirm it. So if it is less than 70, they need to get sugar in their body pretty quickly. And you'd want to use something that the sugar can be broken down and taken in by the body fast. So it's usually high content sugary things. So for example, juice, candies, regular sodas, glucose tablets, which they sell at the store, can get into the blood fairly quickly. After 15 minutes, you'll want to check your blood sugar again to see if you're still under 70 or if it's resolving over 70. If the blood sugar is still low, under 70, then you need to repeat this process until the blood sugar recovers over 70. In a situation where somebody has very severe low blood sugar, where they're unconscious, they're very confused, they're not responding, we actually do have glucagon available to give them. So it does come in an injectable form, which there's a little bit of instruction to it, since it comes in a solid form and you have to mix it with the water to be able to administer it as an injection. And after it's administered, 911 should be called. It does come available now actually in a nasal spray that's much user-friendly, easier to use in an emergency. So you would administer it through the nose and then still call 911. Some things to keep in mind when you have insulin. You don't want to store your insulin in any extreme conditions like extreme heat or extreme cold. You never want to put it in the freezer or in the sunlight or in the car because that can damage the insulin, and so it won't be as effective. You always want to make sure that your insulin is not expired because again, it may be not as effective if the expiration date has passed. And you always want to make sure and look at the bottle or pen and make sure that the insulin looks normal, that there's no particles and there's no color change. That may be a sign that it may have gone bad and it may not work as effective either. One nice thing with these insulin pens is that when you open a pen to use it, you can actually keep it out of the refrigerator and use it for up to 30 days. So it makes it a lot easier to take it with you, say if you're leaving the house or if you're going out to eat. So diabetes and technology. So really it's been amazing to see the advancements have been happening with the technology and diabetes just in a short few years. One of the things you may have seen a lot of commercials for lately are these what we call continuous glucose monitors or CGMs. These are devices that are actually measuring your sugar up to every 5 minutes, and that means you don't have to poke your fingers. These are the ones that are available now on the market. One of them is Dexcom, as you see here. That one now you can actually be able to follow your sugars on your phone that's connected to it through an app. However, it does come with a reader as well. Libre is another very common one. It also now has ability to have an app on your phone, so you can follow it that way, but also comes with a receiver if needed. There is a third CGM, is through Medtronic MiniMed. However, that one's only available to use with their insulin pumps. Another thing that's nice with these devices is they're pretty durable. So you just keep them on and you can shower, you can swim, you can sleep, and they'll stick on. So pretty durable. So very recently, Libre and Dexcom came out with the newest versions of their CGMs. Libre has come out with their Libre 3 that we see on the right here, which is actually even smaller than the previous one that's currently available called Libre 2. And with this one, there's not a receiver available with it because it's assumed that the user has a smartphone that they can use on apps with it. And on the left is our Dexcom G7, which just came out a couple months ago, pretty new. And as you see, it's a lot smaller than what it previously looked like here. So it's more comfortable. The nice thing about that one is the previous version, the G6, would take 2 hours sometimes to kind of warm up and be ready to use. With the new G7, it actually only takes 30 minutes, which is really nice. With all three of these brands of CGMs, you're able to actually share your data with your doctor. So you don't actually have to be coming in to give them your blood sugars. They can see things remotely. So if you're having a blood sugar issue or you're having a trend issue, you can let them know and they can take a look at your Dexcom or Libre or MiniMed and give you advice as to what adjustments to make. So CGM targets and just some information in general. So depending on which CGM is worn, they can last between 10 to 14 days. Dexcom typically lasts 10 days, Libre is typically 14. And really what you need is a consistent wearing of the device for at least 14 days to be able to generate enough data. So it can actually give you data on your average blood sugar. It can give you an idea of what your A1C would be. We refer to this on, if you see line number 4, glucose management indicator or GMI. Hemoglobin A1C, we can only check every 3 months since that's the lifespan of a red blood cell. And it really doesn't capture what your blood sugar average is if there's been very recent changes. So oftentimes we're kind of relying more on this GMI as a better indicator of what the blood sugar control has been. So now that we're using CGMs more and more, they've developed guidelines as to what targets to aim for, particularly time and range, we call it. If you jump here to line 8, the target for blood sugars as read by CGM is between blood sugar of 70 to 180. And the target or the goal is to be in this range 70% of the time, since that equals about an A1C of 7%. The nice thing about these CGMs is that they can also send you an alert. So if your sugar is going in about to head low or is low, it will let you know so that you can treat it, or if it's trending low, you can treat it before it gets low. Similarly, it can alarm or alert you if your sugar is going too high, which might be an indication of something else going on, or pump device failure, that kind of thing. So they've really come a far ways, and they're very useful devices. So insulin pumps. So here I have pictures of different insulin pumps, and kind of the concept behind an insulin pump is that it's always giving you a little bit of short-acting insulin. So when you use a pump, you don't use any long-acting. You actually program how much basal insulin, we call it, you want it to give you every hour, and that acts as your basal insulin. When it comes time to eat, you can tell it how much you're going to eat, and it will calculate how much insulin it plans to give you, since it's all short-acting insulin, and you just have to approve it, and it will infuse or pump the insulin in you. So as you can imagine, it makes giving insulin, especially for your meal times or corrections, a lot more convenient when you're doing this multiple times a day, but you don't have to be poking. So with these devices, I'll go through them. This one on the upper left here is a MiniMed Medtronic insulin pump, and the insulin does sit inside, and there is tubing involved, and I'll kind of show you a picture of what it looks like when that tubing is attached to the body. Tandem pump, I would say, is probably one of our most popular pumps right now in terms of trends. So this one works much the same way and also has tubing. Down here, we see what's called our Omnipod pump. And as you see, it looks very different from the other two. So this is the whole pump. And this is the whole thing gets changed out every 3 days. But you do need a separate device or a smartphone to be able to control it. So via the remote, the controller or the phone, you put in all your settings, you tell it how much you're going to eat to give you insulin. So as you can see, it's tubeless. So a lot of athletes tend to gravitate towards this one because they don't have to worry about any tubing as they're playing their sport. Okay. So what's really been progressing and very impressive is now these insulin pumps have been able to link with the CGMs. Furthermore, the insulin pumps are responding to the blood sugars the CGMs are sending them. And it responds by adjusting your basal rate in that moment. It will actually give you extra doses of insulin to bring the sugar down. It will hold the basal insulin to prevent a low blood sugar, as it predicts it roughly 20 to 30 minutes ahead of time. And it will also adjust your insulin in terms of what you're giving yourself for your mealtime based on what it predicts your sugar will do. So it can add correction to what you're going to give yourself for your meal times, or it can subtract based on what's already in your system or what it's sensing your sugar might drop to. So it's really come a far ways, and all the user in terms of data has to input is how much they're going to eat. Outside of that, in terms of kind of what does the user have to do to maintain this? So as I mentioned, you need to put in the carbs or the amount you're going to eat. And I'm going to jump to the next picture here. So for the Tandem and the Medtronic MiniMed, if you look down here, this is more or less what an infusion site looks like. This is something that will need to be changed out every 3 days, and it's done at home. And the supplies that they have to do this are pretty user-friendly. So when say you're going to shower or swim, most people can actually disconnect from their pump at this site, at the insertion site. Though if you look into the research and the development that's been done on those pumps, technically speaking, they can get wet and they can go to a certain depth, or at least they tested them to that. But for the most part, most everyone tends to disconnect. The Omnipod is already on you, so you would just keep it on regardless. So you do need to change this site out every 3 days to ensure that your skin is staying healthy and to make sure you're getting your insulin appropriately. Above that, I do have a picture of the different sites that these infusion sites can be placed. And so rotating is going to be very important. Other than that, it's pretty user friendly. And what's really nice is that in addition to your CGM data, you can also remotely share your pump data with your doctor. They can even download it at the office visit. And what's nice is you see every little change that the pump makes for your basal rate or any little doses it gives you and any doses you give yourself, and then correlates it or shows it on the same page of what your blood sugar is doing. So it's a very, become very, very far in terms of helping to control blood sugars. So this is kind of the newest thing that's under study right now. It's called the bionic pancreas. So it does give insulin very similarly to the other pumps, though it does have a special algorithm, and they've set it up so that it's a little more user-friendly. Sometimes it can be very challenging to try and count or calculate how many carbs you're going to eat. So they've tried to simplify it. So when somebody goes in to give themselves a dose of insulin for their meal, all they have to select from the list is either I'm going to eat my usual amount, more than my usual, or less than my usual, and that's it. The pump takes over from there. We just kind of finished the first part of the study, just looking at the algorithm with insulin, and we've had good results showing that it can really help control blood sugar. Now, what's special about this pump is they are also designing it so it also includes glucagon. So if you remember, our alpha cells makes glucagon, and glucagon helps keep our sugar from dropping. And then people that have had pancreatic surgery, sometimes you lose that ability to produce glucagon. So they've actually found a way to stabilize liquid glucagon, at least long enough for 3 days, to be able to infuse it through a pump. So that's kind of the next phase of the trial that will be starting soon, I believe within the next year. And that would be included inside the pump. You can kind of see to the left here what that vial would look like. And it would mean a separate site because these have to infuse separately. But that's kind of the next phase of the pumps coming out, and it's kind of the next thing. So it's very exciting. I did want to go over some other devices that can make giving insulin a little bit easier. This is something I've really been very impressed by, and really recommending it to folks that are doing injections, but aren't using enough to require a pump or aren't desiring a pump. This is called a Secure. So essentially you fill this device with just short-acting insulin and you insert it into the abdomen. So it looks like this. So anytime you eat, you can squeeze the sides of it and it will give you short-acting insulin 2 units at a time. And it'll stay on there for 3 days. So it's been nice because then you don't have to be injecting so many times for your meal times. Now, because it's only holding the short-acting insulin, you still need to give yourself your basal insulin, which would mean 1 injection or 2 injections a day, but much better than 4 or 5. So this has been a very nice device that more recently has come out. This is another device that if you're injecting insulin can be very helpful. Sometimes it can be challenging to remember how much insulin you gave yourself. And some people can be very concerned of, oh, is it too soon? If I give myself this other dose, am I going to drop? And, having to document all this can be very challenging. So Medtronic has this device called an InPen, which is essentially a smart pen. It has a cartridge inside that you can refill the insulin with, but it records every single time you give yourself insulin, and it records the dose. And now it works with CGMs where it gives you an idea, where it does show you your blood sugar, but then also lets you know, hey, this is how much insulin you have on board. This is when it's going to be out of your system. So people that get worried about having lows from kind of stacking their insulin can help them prevent that low from happening. And on top of that, it records all the data. So as your doctor looks through your data, it's very helpful. Okay, and then lastly, I wanted to mention this device as well. So it can be very challenging for some people to give themselves an injection. So MiniMed actually came up with what we call an iPort, which in a way is a similar concept to the infusion sets we see with the insulin pumps, only instead of perfusing insulin, you just use it as a site to inject the insulin into without actually having to poke your skin every time. So it's very helpful, especially if someone has kind of a phobia of needles or has a very difficult time injecting. They would insert this device. They're very user-friendly to insert, but they only need to do it every 3 days. And so all their injections, they can get right through that port. Okay. All righty, so that's all I had for today. Were there any questions?
Kathleen, I've got one. You, on one of your slides, you had a condition called reactive.
Mhm.
And what occurred to me, one of the difficulties I struggle with, I'm a type 3C and, total pancreatectomy. But my body seems to go through a cycle running 2 to 3 days each. It will tend to be insulin resistant for 2 to 3 days and then flip and become what seems to be carbohydrate resistant. So I have to pay attention to trends and reverse what I'm doing to try to keep it, within the acceptable range, to keep it in a normal range. And I've gotten pretty good at it because I stay somewhere around 80 to 85% in range. But it takes an incredible amount of fuzzy logic to follow the trend and predict whether I'm starting to become insulin resistant or insulin sensitive, does that have any relation to that reactive condition that you had talked about?
So it's a little bit similar concept in terms of insulin resistance, but kind of different pathways. So a lot of times when we say reactive hypoglycemia, this tends to be in people that have actually it tends to be even more so. I feel like I see it in people with pre-diabetes, because at that point they're not on any medications because technically they don't meet criteria. But what happens is that with the insulin resistance, they consume their food, and rather than the insulin being secreted timing wise as it should be, it comes later. So what they experience is a high blood sugar or higher blood sugar, and then the insulin hits them later and then they drop. But it's thought to be more of the going from the higher to the lower number that they get hypoglycemic symptoms. Because some of the sugars that when we see them, they're not actually hypoglycemic, but it's that change, which actually it's kind of similar in people that are dependent on insulin. Some people we kind of notice it's not necessarily just when their sugar's low, but it's that transition of going from high to low. They can feel that drop happening. But when we refer to reactive hypoglycemia, that's more of the setting of what we're referring to and what we're seeing it in.
Okay. One of the other issues that I struggle with, my blood sugar can go up at a rate of 30 points every 5 minutes. I can go from, it can hit a range of 286 points in around 2 hours or less.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the blood sugar coming from when this happens and I haven't eaten the meal?
Right. I think that has more to do with kind of underlying molecular processes and kind of reacting with the type of surgeries that's been done and how things are getting absorbed. I don't have a clear answer why that happens so rapidly like that, but I have a feeling it's more at the molecular level, and there's something that's changed after the surgeries that is I think having an effect on this. What that is exactly, I'm not sure. But I'm very interested to see what kind of research out there has been done, kind of studying this, but more at a molecular level.
Okay. The other question is, I often have low blood sugar. My range during any given day can be between 70 and 350. But when it goes low, my endocrinologist told me that the lows are more dangerous than the highs. And you listed the damage that's caused when your blood sugar is too high, the neuropathy and the vision issues and stuff like that. Are there physical damages caused by the low blood sugar other than the coma and death just from the glucose going too low?
So blood sugars just in general, having low blood sugar, so let's say under 70, but not severely low. There's not long-term effects that happen just from that. The long-term is more like we were talking about the seizure and coma, where when you're sure your body doesn't have enough glucose that you're to the point of a coma or having a seizure, that's when you can start having brain damage. So just in and of itself, having low blood sugar that's not severe to this point doesn't have long-term effects in terms of damage. So with that aspect, it's one of those things where in that moment it can become potentially very dangerous if it keeps dropping in that moment, but kind of long-term effect doesn't have effects like we see with the complications of long-term high blood sugar.
I have everything that Greg said, but I guess I've been at it longer than him. And so I'm doing okay. I'm in my 17th year of surviving pancreatic cancer, and I've had surgery and total pancreatectomy. And I'm just glad that Greg came around. Well, no, not Greg. I mean, I don't mean that all this happens, but for me, it gave me somebody to talk to and bounce things off of. And, I helped them get started on carbohydrate counting and all that stuff. So I loved your presentation, and I'm especially glad that people are actually identifying what our condition as type 3C. So that I continue to tell people I don't have type 1 or type 2. And I because, well, that's another issue. Wait, there was something else here. Oh yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that the exocrine. Yeah, some people don't understand the creon, and they're having trouble digesting, but they don't understand the creon, I find, and and I tell them, well, these are the enzymes that pancreas makes, and but I think sometimes initially people have trouble with that. I thought it was a good presentation. Great review for me.
Right. I see a question here from Veronica. She wants to know who are the best candidates or types of candidates for insulin pumps versus a CGM.
Yeah, so for people that are, say, on injections, and it's really also insurance dependent too, unfortunately, with the CGM coverage. But if for a lot of insurances, if you're on insulin injections, they'll cover for the most part, again, depending on insurance, CGMs. They're trying to kind of make a hard push for at least through Medicare, even if you're just on one shot a day, trying to get CGMs covered. A lot of times there's this requirement they have that you have to be on multiple injections a day, which is just silly. So right now, a lot of insurances do require having insulin injections to be a candidate for CGM. For insulin pump therapy, again, also can sometimes be limited by insurance. Typically, they want to see either you have antibodies against your pancreas, which is a situation for type 1, or you have an undetectable insulin level, which is the case for type 3C. So if you're able to show that you don't have a detectable insulin level, they can cover the insulin pumps. And insulin pumps can typically hold about 300 units of insulin. So you do want to be, a decent amount of insulin before you start. Sometimes you have people that if you're requiring less than 20 or 30 units of insulin a day, it may not be worth it at that point yet to have a pump. Mostly because of the dose, the amount you're using. And for those people that aren't quite there yet, we've been using the Secure, at least to that way they don't have to be injecting so much. But those are typically the things that we kind of look out for and kind of keep in mind with the insurance of when we're considering someone for an insulin pump. And then beforehand, we always want someone to be very comfortable with carb counting, since that's the method you need to use to determine determine how much insulin is given.
Dr. Estrada, thank you. Thank you. Very good presentation.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
Very thorough. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.